The 1800's. Excerpt of an Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Content warning. Mentions of genocide, enslavement, rape, racism. The first Spanish town in Texas, San Antonio, was established in 1718, and Franciscan missionaries founded the mission San Antonio de Valero, the Alamo. Spanish forts, missions, and settlements dotted the territory, especially along the Rio Grande, from Matamoras to Laredo. The indigenous peoples of Texas included the Lupin Apaches, Jumanos, Coahuiltecans, Tonkawas, Carancawas, and Caros, all of whom were more vulnerable to colonization than the more mobile Comanches and Wichitas in West Texas. By the time of Mexican independence, the indigenous population of the province was around 50,000, while Spanish settlers numbered around 30,000. During the first decade of Mexican independence, some 10,000 Cherokees, Seminoles, Shawnees, and many other indigenous communities east of the Mississippi avoided forced removal to Indian Territory and escaped the Iron Heel of the United States by taking refuge in Mexico. One such community was the people of the Coahuila Kickapoo, the Kickapoo Nation, forced out of its homeland when Wisconsin was opened for settlement. The Tohono O'odham Nation did not move anywhere, but the redrawn 1848 border split their homeland. The independent Republic of Mexico provided land grants for their various communities. With Texas's independence from Mexico, then U.S. annexation, many moved south of the imposed new border. The Republic of Mexico opened a door to U.S. domination by granting land to Anglo immigrants. During the first decade of Mexican independence, some 30,000 Anglo-American farmers and plantation owners, along with their slaves, poured into Texas, receiving development land grants. By the time Texas became a U.S. state in 1845, Anglo settlers numbered 160,000. Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, which affected the Anglo-American settlers' quest for wealth in building plantations worked by enslaved Africans. They lobbied the Mexican government for a reversal of the ban, and gained only a one-year extension to settle their affairs and free their bonded workers. The government refused to legalize slavery. The settlers decided to secede from Mexico, initiating the famous and mythologized 1836 Battle of the Alamo, where the mercenaries James Bowie and Davy Crockett and the slave owner William Travis were killed. Although technically an Anglo-American loss, the siege of the Alamo served to stir Anglo-patriotic passions, and with a month at the decisive Battle of San Jacinto, Mexico handed over the province. This was a great victory for the Andrew Jackson administration, for Jackson's brother Mason, who was one of the Texas planters, and especially for the alcoholic settler warrior hero Sam Houston. The former governor of Tennessee, Houston was made commander-in-chief of the Texas Army and president of the new, quote, Texas Republic, end quote, which he helped guide to U.S. statehood in 1845. One of the first acts of the pro-slavery independent government was to establish a counterinsurgency force that, as its name, the Texas Rangers, suggests followed the, quote, American way of war, end quote, in destroying indigenous towns, eliminating native nations in Texas, pursuing ethnic cleansing, and suppressing protest from the Tejanos, former Mexican citizens. Mission San Francisco de Assis, also known as Mission Dolores, was a Spanish Franciscan mission established on the Pacific coast at the same time as the Presidio military base at San Francisco, 1776, the year that Anglo-Americans declared independence from Britain. The purpose of the garrison was twofold: to protect the mission from indigenous inhabitants whose territory the Spanish were usurping, and to round up those same people and force them to live and work for the Franciscan friars at the mission. Mission Dolores was the sixth of the 21 Franciscan missions established between 1769 and 1823, when Mexico disbanded the missions. The establishment of the missions and presidios from San Diego and Los Angeles and Santa Barbara to Carmel, San Francisco, and so on, and Sonoma, traces the colonization of California's indigenous nations. The 500-mile road that connected the missions was called El Camino Real, the Royal Highway. The Spanish military in California was divided into 4 districts, each with Franciscan missions and strategically located presidios. The 1769 establishment of the first presidio in San Diego coincided with the establishment of the first Franciscan mission in California. The second presidio was based in Monterrey in 1770 to defend the 6 missions in the area, as well as the mercury mines in Santa Cruz Mountains. Monterrey became the capital and the only port of entry for shipments to and from Spanish California, and it remained so until 1846, when the United States seized California. These California Franciscan missions and their founder, Junipero Serra, are extravagantly romanticized by modern California citizens and remain popular tourist sites. Very few visitors notice, however, that in the middle of the plaza of each mission is a whipping post. The history symbolized by that artifact is not dead and buried with the generations of indigenous bodies buried under the California crust. The scars and trauma have been passed on from generation to generation. Putting salt in the wounds, as it were, Pope John Paul II in 1888 beatified Junipero Serra, the first step towards sainthood. California indigenous peoples were insulted by this act and organized to prevent the sanctification of a person they considered to have been an exponent of rape, torture, death, starvation, and humiliation of their ancestors, and the attempted destruction of their cultures. Serra would take soldiers with him, randomly kidnapping indigenous individuals and families, recording these captures in his diaries, as in this instance. Quote, "When one fled from between their soldiers' hands, they caught the other. They tied him, and it was all necessary, for even bound he defended himself as that they should not bring him, and flung himself on the ground with such violence that he scraped and bruised his thighs and knees. But at last they brought him. He was most frightened and very disturbed." End quote. In 1878, an old Camilla man named Hanitin told an interviewer of his experience as a child. Quote, "When we arrived at the mission, they locked me in a room for a week. Every day they lashed me unjustly because I did not finish what I did not know how to do, and thus I existed for many days until I found a way to escape. But I was tracked, and they caught me like a fox." End quote. He was fastened to the stage and beaten to unconsciousness. California indigenous peoples resisted this totalitarian order. These insurgent actions are also recorded in official records and diaries, but they seem to have interested few historians until the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, when California indigenous peoples began to do their own research. They found that no mission escaped uprising from within or attacks from outside by communities of the imprisoned along with the escapees. Guerrilla forces of up to 2,000 formed. Without this resistance, there would be no descendants of the California native peoples of the area colonized by the Spanish. Under the protection of the U.S. Army, beginning in 1848, gold seekers from all over the world brought death, torture, rape, starvation, and disease to the indigenous peoples whose ancestral territories included the sought-after goldfields north and east of San Francisco. As Alejandro Murguia describes it, unlike the native peoples for whom gold was irrelevant, the 49ers, quote, "hungered for gold with a sickness," end quote. They would do anything for it. They left families, homes, everything behind. They sailed for 8 months aboard leaky, smelly ships to reach California. Others, captains and sailors, jumped ship at San Francisco, leaving a fleet of abandoned brigs, barks, and schooners to rot by the piers. They slaughtered all the game they could find, and so muddied the rivers and creeks with silt that the once plentiful salmon could not survive. The herds of elk and deer, the food source for Native Americans, were practically wiped out in one summer. The miners cheated and killed each other in the goldfields. In a true reign of terror, U.S. occupation and settlement exterminated more than 100,000 California native people in 25 years, reducing the population to 30,000 by 1870, quite possibly the most extreme demographic disaster of all time. Here too, against impossible odds, the indigenous resisted and survived to tell the story. Had they not done so, there would be no indigenous peoples remaining in Northern California because the objective was to eradicate them. From the onset of the California gold rush, crazed, quote, "gold bugs," end quote, invade indigenous territories, terrorizing and brutally killing those who were in their path. The settlers seemed to require no military assistance in running roughshod over unarmed indigenous residents of fishing communities in a bountiful paradise of woods, rivers, and mountains. The role left for the U.S. Army was to round up the starving indigenous refugees to transport them to established reservations in Oregon and Oklahoma. Abraham Lincoln's campaign for the presidency appealed to the vote of land-poor settlers who demanded that the government, quote, "open," end quote, indigenous lands west of the Mississippi. They were called, quote, "free soilers," in reference to cheap land free of slavery. New gold rushes and other incentives brought new waves of settlers to squat on indigenous land. For this reason, some indigenous people preferred a Confederate victory, which might divide and weaken the United States, which had grown ever more powerful. Indigenous nations in Indian Territory were more directly affected by the Civil War than anyone else. As discussed in Chapter 6, the southeastern nations, the Cherokees, Muskogees, Seminoles, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, the, quote, 5 civilized tribes, end quote, were forcibly removed from their homes during the Jackson administration. But in the Indian Territory, they rebuilt their townships, farms, and ranches, institutions, newspapers, schools, and orphanages. Although a tiny elite of each nation was wealthy and owned enslaved Africans and Indian country on 135 private estates, the majority of the people continued their collective agrarian practices. All 5 nations signed treaties with the Confederacy, each for similar reasons. Within each nation, however, there was a clear division based on class, often misleadingly expressed as a conflict between, quote, mixed bloods and full bloods. That is, the wealthy, assimilated, slave-owning minority that dominated politics favored the Confederacy, and the non-slave-owning poor and traditional majority wanted to stay out of the Anglo-American Civil War. Historian David Chang found that the Muskogee nationalism and well-founded distrust of federal power played a major role in bringing about that nation's strategic alliance with the Confederacy. Chang writes, quote, "Was the Creeks Council alliance with the South a racist defense of slavery and its class privileges, or was it a nationalist defense of Creek lands and sovereignty? The answer has to be both," end quote. John Ross, principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, at first called for neutrality, but changed his mind for reasons similar to the Muskogees and asked the Cherokee Council for authority to negotiate a treaty with the CSA. Nearly 7,000 men of the 5 nations went into battle for the Confederacy. Stan Whitey, a Cherokee, held the post of brigadier general in the Confederate Army. His 1st Indian Brigade of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi was among the last units in the field to surrender to the Union Army on June 23, 1865, more than 2 months after Robert E. Lee's surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. During the war, however, many indigenous soldiers became disillusioned and went over to the Union forces, along with enslaved African Americans who fled to freedom. Another story is equally important, though less often told. A few months after the war broke out, some 10,000 men living in Indian Territory, made up of indigenous volunteers, along with African Americans who had freed themselves and even some Anglo-Americans, engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Confederate Army. They fought from Oklahoma into Kansas, and where many of them joined unofficial Union units that had been organized by abolitionists who had trained with John Brown years earlier. This was not likely the kind of war the Lincoln administration had desired, a multi-ethnic volunteer Union contingent fighting pro-slavery forces, where in Missouri, where enslaved Africans escaped to join the Union side. The self-liberation by African Americans occurring all over the South led to Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed freed Africans to serve in combat. In Minnesota, which had become a non-slavery state in 1859, the Dakota Sioux were on the verge of starvation by 1862. When they mounted an uprising to drive out the mostly German and Scandinavian settlers, Union Army troops crushed the revolt, slaughtering Dakota civilians and rounding up several hundred men. 300 prisoners were sentenced to death, but upon Lincoln's orders to reduce the numbers, 38 were selected at random to die, and the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. Bibliography Citations. Ortiz, Roxanne Dunbar, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, Beacon Press, 2014.